It all started when I was home alone. It was an ordinary Friday evening. My parents had gone away for the weekend, and I had the house all to myself. I was looking forward to a peaceful, quiet night, without the usual noise of family. The house felt empty just the way I liked it. I had no particular plans, only the intention of watching some movies and relaxing. It had been a stressful week and I needed to unwind. The familiar sound of the refrigerator humming and the occasional creak of the floorboards underfoot were the only noises breaking the silence as I made myself comfortable on the couch, pulling the blanket over me. The night felt calm, almost too calm, as if the world outside had frozen in time. I wasn't expecting anything unusual, but then again, nothing had ever prepared me for the events that would unfold in the hours to come. It wasn't long before I started to feel watched. A strange, inexplicable sensation that seemed to gnaw at the edges of my mind. I tried to dismiss it, blaming it on the isolation and the stillness of the house. After all, I was used to being alone, right? But that night, the stillness felt different. It felt oppressive. The sound came quietly at first. A soft, almost imperceptible thump from upstairs. I froze, my attention snapping to the ceiling above. Was it just the house settling? A creak of the wood? I convinced myself it was nothing, but then the sound came again, louder this time. Footsteps, heavy, slow. The unmistakable sound of someone walking across the floor, dragging their feet. My heart skipped a beat. I stood up, walking slowly toward the stairs, my mind racing with possible explanations. It couldn't be anyone. My parents were gone. No one had been here since the morning. I hesitated, staring up the staircase, the shadow of the hallway light stretching across the walls like an old photograph. The air felt thick, heavier than usual, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I took a cautious step forward, feeling the coolness of the hardwood floor beneath my feet. There it was again. A louder thud, like something, or someone, was pacing up there, waiting for me. My stomach twisted in knots. I turned on the light and slowly ascended the stairs, each step seeming to echo through the empty house. But when I reached the top, everything was eerily still. Nothing. No one. I let out a long, shaky breath and shook my head. It was just my imagination, I told myself. The house was old. Maybe it was just the wind outside. I had to calm down. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I decided to go back downstairs to try to distract myself. Maybe the TV would help. As I sat back down on the couch, I flicked the remote to turn on the TV. The room was dimly lit by the glow of the screen, the shadows dancing against the walls as I searched for something to watch. It was then that I noticed the lights above me flicker just for a second, then they went out completely, plunging the room into... My heart raced. I reached for my phone to turn on the flashlight, but just as I did, the lights flickered back on. It was as if they were responding to something, as if something had just disturbed them. The hairs on my arms stood on end, and a cold shiver ran down my spine. I tried to shrug it off. Maybe it was a surge in the electrical system. I had heard of these things happening before, but when I glanced up, I realized I could no longer ignore the strange feeling that had settled into my chest. Something was wrong. The tapping started as a faint sound, almost imperceptible. It seemed to be coming from the window. I leaned forward, squinting into the darkness outside, but nothing was visible. The trees in the yard swayed gently in the breeze, their branches casting long shadows on the ground. I looked away for a moment to try to convince myself that it was the wind or maybe an insect against the glass. But then it came again, a soft, rhythmic tapping. It wasn't the wind and it wasn't any bug. The sound was deliberate, as if someone was lightly tapping on the glass with their fingers. I stood up abruptly, my pulse quickening, and walked cautiously toward the window, every step feeling heavier than the last. The closer I got, the more the sound intensified, and now it felt like it was coming from directly outside, just inches away from me. I pressed my face to the glass, looking out into the night, trying to see if anyone was out there. I saw nothing. No movement. No shadow of a person. The world was still and quiet except for the tapping that seemed to continue, relentless, as though mocking me. I quickly backed away, my hands shaking as I tried to steady my breathing. But just as I turned around, the tapping stopped. The silence that followed felt suffocating, almost as if the very air had thickened around me. It was then that I heard the voice in my head, urging me to check the other windows. I wanted to stay put, to ignore it, but my curiosity got the better of me. I walked slowly to the other side of the house, checking each window one by one. Nothing. There was no one there. Exhaled, my heart still racing, trying to convince myself that it was nothing. I was alone, and that should have been comforting. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching me. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, cutting through the heavy silence of the room. I picked it up, hoping it was just a message from a friend, but it was a call, an unknown number. My first instinct was to ignore it, but something compelled me to answer. I held the phone to my ear, expecting to hear a voice on the other side. But there was nothing. Just static, then a faint, almost imperceptible sound of breathing. I held the phone tighter, listening closely, straining to make out the source of the sound. "Hello?" I said, my voice shaky. There was no response, just more breathing, low and steady. It felt like someone was on the other end, but they weren't speaking. They were listening to me, waiting for me to speak. My fingers trembled as I slowly pulled the phone away from my ear, thinking it might be a prank call. But as I did, I heard something that made my blood run cold. In the silence that followed, there was a whisper so faint I could barely make it out. "Help me." The words seemed to hang in the air, their meaning slipping through my mind like smoke. I couldn't breathe. I wanted to speak, to ask who it was, but the phone slipped from my hand and fell to the floor. The call had ended, but the words, "Help me," echoed in my mind. I couldn't shake them. They haunted me, and the fear that gripped me now was unlike anything I'd ever felt before. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet without warning. The warm, comfortable air I'd been enjoying just moments ago became frigid, biting at my skin as if winter had arrived without any warning. I looked around, expecting to see the heater running, but it was off. The chill in the room grew so intense that I could see my breath in the air, condensing into small clouds of mist as I exhaled. I pulled the blanket tighter around my shoulders, trying to ward off the cold. But it wasn't just the physical chill that bothered me. The air felt wrong. It felt heavy, thick, as though something unseen was pressing down on me, constricting my chest, making it harder to breathe. I had never experienced cold like this inside a house before. It wasn't the kind of cold that comes with an open window or a draft. It was deeper, as if the very walls of the house were exhaling a frozen breath, wrapping me in an unnatural chill. I shivered uncontrollably, my mind racing for an explanation, but none came. The house had always been warm, always been comforting, but tonight everything was different. My surroundings felt unfamiliar, hostile. I wanted to get up, to move, to leave the room, but my legs felt frozen, my body unwilling to obey. The coldness was suffocating. I couldn't stay here anymore. It started as a faint sound, distant, almost inaudible, but as I sat there, the knocking grew louder, sharper, more insistent. It was coming from the front door. My first thought was that it must be someone, maybe a neighbor or a friend who had arrived unexpectedly, but there was a cold pit in my stomach that told me otherwise. I got up slowly, my pulse quickening, each step feeling heavier than the last. I approached the door. The knocking stopped, and in that instant I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. I reached for the doorknob, my hand shaking slightly as I touched it. I turned the knob slowly, almost cautiously, expecting to see a familiar face, someone I could recognize. But when I peeked through the peephole, I was met with an overwhelming wave of emptiness. No one. I stood there for a moment, confused. The porch light outside flickered, casting eerie shadows across the empty yard. But still, no movement, no footsteps, nothing. I pulled away from the door, my mind racing. I had definitely heard knocking, but it didn't make any sense. Who could it have been? I turned to walk back inside, but as I did, I heard it again, the knocking, louder this time, like it was coming from inside the house. I spun around, heart racing in my chest. I knew there was no one in the house. I had locked all the doors earlier. I checked every corner, every room. My mind began to spin as the knock echoed through the silence, deep, deliberate. It was mocking me, playing with my fears. I didn't dare open the door again. I backed away, my breath coming in short, shallow bursts, my chest tight with anxiety. I needed to collect myself. I decided to head to the bathroom to splash some water on my face. I tried to steady my hands as I turned, on the faucet, staring at my reflection in the mirror. But something felt off. The room, which was usually well lit, was now swallowed by a strange dimness, as if the very light had been drained from the walls. My eyes drifted from my reflection to the mirror, and for a split second, something in the corner of the frame caught my attention. A shadow. It wasn't mine, and it wasn't part of the natural movement of light in the room. It was darker, a moving shape that shouldn't have been there. I turned around quickly, expecting to see someone standing behind me, but there was no one. I looked back at the mirror. The shadow was gone, but I could still feel its presence, as if something was standing just out of my line of sight. My heart began to pound in my chest, louder now, the sound echoing in my ears. I felt the air grow heavier, thick with something unseen. I was about to turn away to leave the bathroom when the reflection shifted. Just slightly. My own face twisted, distorted with a grotesque expression I didn't make. It was as if something was staring back at me. Something I couldn't see, but that was there, hidden just beyond the surface of the glass. The reflection seemed to smile, something malicious in its movement. I staggered back, my breath caught in my throat, and the image in the mirror returned to normal. My face was still there, calm, but I could feel the lingering unease. Something was watching me. I quickly left the bathroom, my heart still racing. The house felt colder now, darker, as though the walls themselves were closing in around me. I needed to do something, anything, to break the tension. I grabbed the remote and turned on the television, hoping the distraction would ease the growing sense of dread that was crawling up my spine. But instead of the usual static or channel lineup, the screen flickered and filled with white noise, the kind of static you get when a TV isn't tuned to any station. The sharp sound of the static filled the room, grinding against my nerves. My eyes locked on the screen, unwilling to look away, even as the fuzziness grew thicker. And then, through the static, I saw it. A figure, a shadowy shape, standing perfectly still right in the middle of the screen. It wasn't just the distortion. It wasn't a glitch. No, this was something else. A figure that shouldn't have been there. Something I couldn't explain. It was tall, impossibly tall, its features blurred and indistinct, but I could feel its presence. It was staring at me. I slammed the remote into my hand, trying to change the channel, but the screen remained the same. The figure didn't move, and the static intensified like the television itself was trying to scream at me. Suddenly, the figure reached out toward the screen, its hand extending toward me. My breath caught in my throat. I tried to turn the TV off, but nothing worked. The figure seemed to grow, stretching toward me from within the confines of the screen. It was like it was coming through, pulling itself into my reality. With a jolt, the screen went black. The TV cut out completely. The room was plunged back into silence. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed. What was that? What had just happened? The room was unnervingly quiet after the TV shut off, but my mind raced. I couldn't tell if I was imagining things or if something truly paranormal was at play. I tried to shake off the feeling, but it lingered, like a shadow lurking just beyond my reach, too close to escape. My body was still stiff, frozen in place. I needed to move, to do something, but the weight of the silence was too oppressive. It felt like the air had thickened, pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. Then, as if the silence wasn't enough to torment me, I heard it, a whisper, faint but unmistakable, coming from the kitchen. "Help me," it breathed, the voice sounding so distant yet so clear, as though it was speaking directly into my ear. My blood ran cold. The words felt like they were woven with sorrow, like a cry for help lost in the dark, yet I knew no one had been here to say them. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. The house was empty. My mind raced through all the logical explanations. Perhaps I was just hearing things. Maybe the wind had caused a sound or the house had settled. But my instincts screamed that something far darker was happening. I didn't want to go to the kitchen. The voice seemed to be calling me, pulling me toward it. But the more I resisted, the more it gnawed at me. I had to know. Maybe if I confronted whatever it was, I could end this. I was wrong. So terribly wrong. With trembling legs, I made my way toward the kitchen, my heart pounding in my chest. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet, echoing in the empty space. As I reached the doorway, I hesitated, terrified of what I might find on the other side. I braced myself, taking a deep breath, and turned the corner into the kitchen. There was nothing. The room was as I had left it, the lights dimly casting shadows on the counters. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator, which felt far too loud in the stillness. I stood there staring into the empty space, waiting for something to happen, anything. Then from the corner of my eye, I caught a flash of movement, a blur darting just out of sight. My head snapped toward it, but once again I saw nothing. Mind was racing, my body frozen in terror. What had I just heard? Where had it come from? And why did I feel like I was being pulled into something I couldn't escape? I quickly backed out of the kitchen, trying to regain some semblance of control. My pulse pounded in my ears, making it hard to think straight. I needed to get away from this house, to leave before things got worse. But when I turned back into the living room, I froze in my tracks. The furniture was different. The coffee table, which had been positioned in the center of the room, had moved. Not by much, just a few inches, but enough to be noticeable. The couch cushions had been rearranged, and the rug seemed to be shifted slightly to the side. The things around me didn't feel right, like they were subtly altering, shifting just enough to unsettle me. My stomach twisted into a knot. I hadn't touched anything. I hadn't moved anything. There was no logical explanation for this. I approached the coffee table carefully, my steps tentative as I reached out to touch it. I expected the feeling of cold wood beneath my fingers, but instead, it felt unnervingly warm, almost as though it had just been touched by someone else. Jerked my hand away, stepping back in alarm. I glanced around the room, my eyes darting from the lamp to the bookshelf. Everything felt wrong. I couldn't shake the overwhelming sensation that something, or someone, was moving around me, playing with my surroundings as if they were a puppet master, manipulating the world around me. I took another step back, my heart thumping so loudly I could hear it in my ears. There was no explanation for what I was seeing, no rational explanation for the objects shifting. The air around me seemed to hum with an eerie energy, as though the house itself had come alive, watching, waiting for the next move. I couldn't stay in the room any longer. I turned toward the front door, desperate to leave, but when I reached for the doorknob, something stopped me. The door. It was ajar, just slightly, like someone had opened it but no one had come in. I paused, my hand hovering over the door. I was sure I had locked it before. I was certain of it. But now it stood open just enough for me to feel an icy draft seep through. A strange, unsettling feeling gripped me as I stared at the crack, as though something were lurking just on the other side, waiting for the right moment to pounce. Without thinking, I stepped forward, pushing the door open the rest of the way. The darkness outside was suffocating. The porch light flickered once, casting long shadows across the yard, but there was no one in sight. Then came the sound. A soft creaking, followed by the unmistakable scrape of something or someone shuffling just outside the door. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I stepped back quickly, my heart racing, but just before I could turn away, the door shook, violently, as though someone or something was trying to force it open. A cold wave of dread washed over me. I knew I had to get out of here. I wasn't alone anymore, but as I spun toward the hallway, I heard it. The whisper. Faint, almost, drowned in the wind. The voice was not my own. It was something darker, older, and far more terrifying. And it wasn't calling me from outside. It was calling me to stay. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned to run, but something stopped me. The shadows in the hallway had shifted, twisted. They didn't follow the normal path the light cast. Instead, they crept toward me, stretching longer and darker, as though they had minds of their own. I froze in place, unable to move, my limbs heavy with terror. As the shadows grew, I could hear faint whispers emanating from them, growing louder, surrounding me. They called my name, soft at first, but the voices grew urgent, desperate. I could no longer distinguish one voice from another. They all blended into a cacophony of unintelligible sounds. I closed my eyes, praying it would stop. When I opened them again, the shadows had taken shape. Figures. Dark, humanoid shapes that were now standing at the end of the hallway, waiting, watching. I tried to back away, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. The shadows moved closer, their presence suffocating, their whispers now a full-blown chant. I felt an overwhelming pressure on my chest, as if invisible hands were squeezing the life out of me. The air was thick, and I gasped for breath, my vision blurring. Just as I thought I would collapse, I managed to move my legs. I bolted toward the front door, throwing it open, my heart pounding in my ears. But as I stepped outside, the cold air was like a slap to my face. There was no escape. The moment I stepped outside, the door slammed shut behind me, and I felt the weight of something heavy, something that had followed me. I turned back toward the house. In the window I saw it, my own reflection, but not quite. It smiled at me, its face twisted in a grotesque, mocking grin, and then everything went black. The next morning the house was quiet, too quiet. My parents returned to find everything untouched. The door was locked and there was no sign of struggle. The TV, the shadows, the whispers, all of it was gone, like it had never happened. But I knew what I had seen. I knew it wasn't my imagination. The house, though silent, still felt haunted. And I knew that somehow it wasn't finished. It was only a matter of time before whatever